Hi everyone, it's Rebecca Jones here, Tippy Connect Liaison. Thanks so much for sharing your lunchtime with us today. Today we are on part 3 of our job search series, a 4-part event designed to give you all the information you need to brush up on not only the basics, but the intricacies of job hunting as well. The Tippy Connect Job Search Series is sponsored by MetroNet. MetroNet understands the value of supporting young professionals in their career path and was recognized as a best place to work by Glassdoor 2020. They're always looking for new associates to join their team, so you can learn more about them at metronetinc.com/careers. Our speaker for this series is Cory, a career coach with the University of Utah. Thank you, Crystal, for being with us today. We are excited to learn about interviewing. Everyone, grab your lunch and get ready to learn with us. Crystal, take it away.
Thank you, as always, Becca, and thank you to everyone who's attending. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names on the list, which is very exciting. Let me share my screen with you real quick. Get my screen set up on my side. There we go. And today, as Becca mentioned, we're going to be talking about interviewing. We're going to go through some questions. We're going to go through some preparation. We're going to go through what you should do after the interview. We're going to cover a lot of things. Interviewing is a very intricate thing with a lot of steps in every one of those processes that I just outlined. So as always, feel free to ask questions either throughout the presentation or during the Q&A at the end. With that, we're going to get started. Again, since a lot of you have come to a lot of my other webinars, which I super appreciate, we're going to start off with the single word sum up. So when you think about interviewing, everything that goes into interviewing, what's one word that describes your feelings about interviewing? And feel free to drop those into the chat. Anxious, for sure. Pretty common emotion when it comes to interviewing. What else are we feeling when it comes to interviewing? I know for me, even though it's literally my job to know how to interview, I still get nervous when it comes to interviews. It's really about the preparation that comes with interviews and the preparation that you've done in advance that can help make you feel more comfortable once you actually get into the space. I'm going to give it like 30 more seconds if anyone wants to share the words that they feel when it comes to interviewing. Just unsure in general, could be fine, could be not fine. That's a good answer. I like that. Not that anxious isn't a good answer. Like 10 more seconds. Hopeful. Love that. Yes. Hopefully by the end of our presentation today, my presentation, it's fine. We're all in this together. All of you will be feeling a little bit more hopeful when it comes to interviewing. So to start things off, because there's so much that goes into interviewing, I want to talk just a little bit about the preparation that goes into interviewing. Obviously, this is going to be kind of like a summary of what you should be doing to prepare, but hopefully it'll give you some insight into the things that you should be thinking about before you go into that interview. The first thing when it comes to preparation is research, and it's research about you and also the company. You really need to be looking at their values, what projects have they worked on, do a deep dive into their website and think about how you fit into that company, that role, that organization, that department, whatever it could be. I've listed some resources underneath research that you can use for that, one of which is Glassdoor. There's a lot of information about the ins and outs of the company. Sometimes people even list interview questions that they were asked when they were interviewed at that company last, so that can be a really helpful resource as well. Just Googling the company, again, finding their website and really looking into the ins and outs of the company, at least according to them, can be very helpful. And then I also listed employees, because if it's something that you're really, really interested about working there, you can reach out to employees that already work there and ask them like the nitty-gritty of the company, right? Not only to make sure that you want to work there like for real, but to give some inside information that can help you throughout your interview. I know when I was interviewing at the University of Utah, I reached out to one of the career coaches that worked there and said, hey, I submitted my application. I'm really interested in working here. Like, what can you tell me? And he mentioned that it was a very strengths-based department within the college. So what I did was I took the StrengthsFinder test and I related it to how my strengths line up with the position, which impressed everyone. And I'm not saying that's what got me the job, but it definitely couldn't have hurt. The second thing to think about when it comes to preparation is reflecting on your experiences. And by this, I mean, reflect on times where you use skills that can be used in this job. So, for example, if you're interviewing for a position that has a lot of multitasking, organization, prioritization, things like that, reflect on a time where you had to handle a lot of things all at once and have that story kind of in the back of your head for you to tell during that interview if it comes up. And we'll talk more about what that means a little bit later. But for resources for reflection, I listed friends, families, coworkers, even looking back at old resumes and things like that. In my experience, a lot of people forget a lot of what happens during their past work experiences, partly because you're moving on to the next thing, your focus is in a different place, but a lot of people also tend to undersell how cool they are, in my opinion. So feel free to reach out to any or all of those people to say, what's something that I should really be talking about during my interview? What's something that helps me stand out? And whatever they say, you might not think that it's that cool because your strengths come naturally to you. So you can't imagine a world in which everybody doesn't have this skill, but it can really help you stand out in the interview as well. And then finally, practice your interviewing skills. I don't know why people don't do this more. I think it's because on its surface, interviewing is just answering questions and talking to another person, right? But you wouldn't go to the World Cup the first time you're playing soccer, right? Like, this is a really big deal. There's a lot that's riding on this. On the surface, it seems like talking, but there's actually a lot of strategy that goes into it, a lot of thinking, a lot of preparation, as we're talking about here. So practicing with anybody and everybody that will ask you questions and listen and give their feedback is definitely going to be to your advantage. Moving on, we're now going to cover something that I like to call the big three. These three questions that we're about to talk about, I think cover the foundation of most interviews that you're going to be coming across. But as we go through them, I'm going to put the question on the screen. I'm going to ask you all why you think employers ask that question, or what do you think their motivations are behind it. Then we'll talk about why, according to the recruiters that I've talked to, they ask this, a strategy for answering that question, and then some other examples that you might hear in that question. So to start things off, this is a pretty common question that a lot of interviewers start off with. Tell me about yourself. Go ahead and in the chat, why do you think employers start off with this question during interviews? Y'all just have no idea why people ask this question. Polite, they want to hear a bit about you. They want to see what you think is important to mention. That's a good point. Why else do you think they answer this question? Or does someone have a different thought they want to share? I'm gonna give it 30 more seconds before I move on. Get a feel for your general character for sure. So honestly, I think it's kind of all these things. Really, it's to kind of break the ice, get the interview started, get you talking, kind of hear a little bit more about you, get a feel for your general character. It's kind of all these things that you all mentioned. It's just a good question to kind of start things off. The strategy that I like to use for this is past, present, future, and you're definitely going to hear about this more next week when we talk about networking, but it also applies to this question. When I say past, I don't mean like, on a Thursday, I was born into a family of, no, that's too much past. They don't need that much background on you. When I say past, what I really mean is what I like to call your aha moment. So what was one moment or one experience, or maybe it was a sequence of experiences that kind of put you on the path that you're on now? For me, that's an internship I had in undergrad where I was working with people that on their job applications and their resumes, and people didn't realize how cool they are. And I realized that helping them realize how cool they are was pretty rewarding work. So that kind of started me on my path towards being a career coach. So when I'm giving this past, present, future, that's the moment that I'm going to be talking about. So then from past, you move on to the present. And when I say present, I don't mean you need to run down like your entire resume. You don't need to go into detail about anything currently that you're doing, but give them like a highlight reel. They already have your application. They already have your resume, but you can say something to the effect of, because of these experiences, I'm now doing this thing, right? And then for future, What I really mean in regards to this is goals. And I don't mean necessarily like a 5-year plan. It could be depending on what you're interviewing for, but you can say, you know, looking towards the future, I really want to get experience in XYZ. And I know that's a really big part of this role. So I'm really excited to be interviewing for this. Whatever your goals are, whatever experience you want to be gaining, whatever skills, whatever, maybe it's just that you want to work for a company that is more ingrained with your values. Whatever those future goals look like, connect it back to the company so it comes back to why you're excited about the role. And then just as an example, because not everybody says, tell me about yourself. Everybody asks their questions a little bit differently in interviews. It could come across as describe yourself and why you're interested in this position or this company. There is some variations, but when it comes to interviewing, you definitely want to be listening to what they are asking and then thinking about what they're actually asking. In this case, you know, the example question is pretty much tell me about yourself, so it's safe to go back to that past, present, future format. Moving on to the next question in the big three, what are your strengths? Why do you all, again, say in the chat, think that they ask this question during an interview? To see if you read the job description, it could be. That's an interesting take on it. I'm not saying that's wrong. To see what you feel your strengths are and to see if they align with the position. I like that. I think those two are actually kind of related the more that I look at them. 30 more seconds. Yes, twinsies. 30 more seconds. Why do you think employers ask about your strengths during an interview? Apparently everybody's in agreement, and that's totally fine. So before I move on to the next section on like the purpose behind it and the strategies and things like that, if you've used these words for your strengths, I want you to just put like a quick yes in the chat. If ever in your life in an interview you've used one of these 4 words or more of them. We have an oop. We don't even have a yes. Y'all don't even know why I'm asking this and you already feel bad about your answers. We have a yes. Okay. 3 people so far. 4 people so far. See, we're getting there. So a lot of us have used them. I'll admit that at some point I've probably used these words. Why do y'all think that I'm bringing up the fact that a lot of us have used these words? They're passive, okay. Why else do you think I'm bringing it up? Overuse, there we go. That's the answer I'm looking for. So at one of my past institutions, spring semester was the really big semester for mock interviews because everybody was looking for jobs. People were going on interviews constantly. So it feels like that's the only kind of appointment I did, which is fine. In my office at this institution, I had a whiteboard in my office. So during mock interviews, I noticed that I was hearing these same words over and over and over again. So I started keeping count, like literally tally marks on my whiteboard, which I don't know why nobody ever saw them until I pointed them out, but they never did, which is a whole other conversation probably. But in the 4 weeks that I was keeping count, I had 26 separate people tell me that they were hardworking. That's a lot of people. You know, I don't remember the count specifically for these other 4 words that I've listed, but all of them were well over 10 people for each word. The point of an interview is to help you stand out, right? And I think that a lot of people go back to these words because in American working culture, we're kind of conditioned to think that this is what a good worker is, right? They should be passionate about their work. They need to be organized about it, which helps them be detail oriented. And they need to work so hard at the job that they do, which is well and good. But like, that's every employee ever, I would say, at least for the most part. But honestly, like, I don't think these words really mean anything. Now, don't feel bad if you've used these words or if you feel like, but like, those are my strengths. Like, what am I supposed to do about this? I have the answer. So let's take hardworking for the example. I think this word can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I've had, you know, some people say that no matter the obstacle, they get the job done and make sure that it's done on time, right? to me, that sounds like they're persevering or they're persistent, right? Which both sound way better than hardworking does. When it comes to organized, I know that I've used that word to describe myself before, but once I realized that everybody says that, I kind of drilled down into the reason why I'm so organized, and I realized that being organized helped me to be an efficient worker. So I use efficient instead of organized, right? I think a lot of these 4 words are like these really big boxes with a lot of different words and a lot of different definitions inside of them. And to really make yourself stand out for the strengths question, you got to dig down into that box and see what those words mean to you, and then come up with a little more specific words to use when it comes to your interview answer. Which moves on to our next thing. So all of these things that you were saying before, to see if you read the job description, to see if your strengths align with the job description, or, just to get your take on your own strengths, all of those are definitely accurate. For the strategy for this one, I would pick, honestly, 3 to 5 unique words to describe your strengths. I say 5 because I have heard of employers getting frisky and asking for your top 5 strengths. I don't think it's all too common, but you can't ever be over-prepared for an interview. And then the second part of the strategy, I would say, is telling stories about your strengths. I know for a lot of people, it's really awkward to describe your strengths because, like I said before, like they just come so naturally to you, you have a hard time describing it. But I know that you all have stories about a time that you used that strength, right? So if they're saying, oh, what's your top strengths? You can say, I believe my top strengths are that I'm efficient and that I'm persistent. And here's a time where I did that. And you can then tell a story where you demonstrate those strengths to show the employer those strengths in action, and they can kind of determine what that means for you and them moving forward. Other examples are pick 3 words to describe yourself, or what would your coworkers say about you? This last question in particular, what would your coworkers say about you? You can kind of get the answer to that because during your preparation, when you're reflecting on your skills and experiences, you can ask your coworkers for their opinions. And then based on what they say, you can actually relate that back to the employer, and they're going to be so impressed that you had the foresight to do this. So that's the strengths question and strategies and things like that. Like I said, it's going to be a decent bit of work for you to drill down and see what your strengths are, but you can also use a lot of resources, friends, families, coworkers, to figure out what your strengths are and how you can best articulate them. Final question for the big 3, what are your weaknesses? And again, in the chat, why don't you say why you think employers ask this question? To see how you can overcome your weakness and relate it to positivity in the workplace. No idea. Always feels like this question is meant to trip you up, which is a fair perspective to have for sure. Any other reasons why you all think they asked this question? Neat. So before I go into the purpose and all that, another activity where I just want you to put, we have one more, to see if you've learned to rely on your coworkers and help in places where you are weaker. I like that answer. That's a very interesting perspective. I learned so much by talking to you all during these webinars. One more time, and you can just say yes in the chat if this applies to you. How many of you have heard to get around this question, you're supposed to frame your weakness as a strength? I know I was told that when I was first starting to interview. We have an oop again. We've had yes. I've heard that. Yeah, so at this point, I've done a lot of mock interviews in my career as a career coach, even though I haven't been a full-on career coach for all that long. Honestly, whenever people frame their weakness as a strength, it sounds like you're not answering the question. It sounds like you're avoiding it on purpose. It sounds like you're completely missing the point, which you kind of are. So what I will say is a big misconception that I think people have, and I definitely hear what you're saying about it's meant to trip you up and it feels all really awkward and kind of weird. They're not asking this question to kind of evaluate your weakness, unless it's you're a project coordinator and you say you're bad at teamwork. Like, that's kind of a red flag for them. But for the most part, they're not looking for that. They're really looking for like the second half of the strategy, which I'll get to in a second. The purpose for this question is really to see if you can honestly self-evaluate and if you have the motivation to improve yourself without a lot of like external motivation or people saying that you have to do this. So for the strategy, I put weakness but improvement, but there's actually kind of a ratio that I've seen work a little bit better for this answer. So like a third of your answer should be describing the weakness that you have or the area of growth that you have. And it could be that you just describe it generally, or again, you can tell a story about it. You know, something that I've been working on for myself is my ability to tell people no. And here's a time where I really failed at doing that. Then you can tell a story about a time where you saying yes to everybody kind of, you know, piled on so much things that you couldn't function. You ruined everything, except not really, because you all are great. But the next 2/3 of your answer should be talking about how you've been working on that. And when I say improvement, I really mean in specific concrete detail. As you all know, I work at a university, so I talk to a lot of undergraduate students. And generally, when I'm talking about the weakness question, almost everybody says their biggest weakness is procrastination, which, like, I feel that on a spiritual level. But usually for that improvement piece, they're always like, and I just try to keep it top of mind. I look at my calendar often and put it in a place where I can see it to keep it at the top of mind that I should be doing other stuff. Honestly, that means they're watching Netflix and just feeling guilty about it. That doesn't show me how they're working on it, right? Whereas if someone else said that they bought a planner, they look at it every morning, every noon, every night to make sure that they're on their stuff, you know, if they set up a reward system for themselves, any of that really concrete, specific information is really, really helpful for me, because then I can see that they're actually taking steps to work on this area of growth. For the example questions, again, sometimes they'll say, what's an area of growth for you? They're trying to spin it a little bit more positive so that it's not all negative. But some people I've also heard recently just say, what do you feel least prepared for in this role specifically? Which is also something to think about. When you talk about your weaknesses, it doesn't have to be an overall weakness that you've been working on. It can be something specific about the role that you're applying to, right? So if they're asking for you to use Access for this role that you're interviewing for, and you're not ultra familiar with Access, for this question, you can say something to the effect of, you know, I don't have a ton of experience working with Access. I'm usually more of in the Excel Word document kind of area, but I know that it's essential to this role. So when I get this position, I'm going to work really, really hard and do a lot of like side trainings and ask a lot of questions so that I can master it quickly so that I can get to being successful in this role, right? So it doesn't have to be overall, it can be specific to the job description, like I said. So those are the big three. Do you all have any questions, concerns about the big three before we move on? Feel free to drop those questions in the chat. I'm going to give it like 30 seconds, just because we do have a question and answer session at the end. Seeing none, let's move on. So another type of question that is becoming increasingly more common when it comes to interviews is what are called behavioral questions. These questions are questions that oftentimes start with, tell me about a time where, or how have you handled situations where, can you give me an example of a time of, these types of questions all fall under behavioral questions. The purpose of a behavioral question is to see how you react in certain situations that they feel like you're going to come up in the job. If, you know, based on your past experiences, maybe you'll react that way moving forward, right? So it's really them asking about your history. For the strategy, I use the PART method, which I will go into here in a second, but essentially the strategy for answering these questions is telling a really good story. So at the beginning, when I was talking about reflecting on your different experiences, reflecting on your skills, all those things, that's really going to help you when it comes to these behavioral questions. You're never going to know exactly what they're going to ask you in an interview because everybody does things a little bit differently. But you can have an idea of what they're going to ask, at least in the behavioral question side of things. If you go through the job description and every skill that you've highlighted and things like that, think of a story that corresponds to it and have a short list of it in your head before you go into that interview. Chances are, you know, if organization is a really big part of the job, they're going to ask about that at some point, most likely, so you can have those stories kind of at the ready.
So for the PART method, it's a 4-part method that's going to help you tell really amazing stories during your interview. And this 4-part method also applies when you're telling those stories, maybe in your strength question or your weaknesses question. Anytime you're telling a story in your interview, this is the method that you want to use. The P in PART stands for problem. So the context of the situation, while I was working at ABC company, we had a situation where XYZ was happening, right? Just kind of giving them the background information so they kind of know what you're talking about. The A in PART stands for action, and something that I really want to emphasize for this action piece is it's the action that you took. A lot of times, because teamwork is so important in this day and age, they're going to ask questions about a time where you had a conflict on a team or you had to work in a team to solve a problem. And usually when I ask those questions in mock interviews, a lot of people say, we did this, we did that, we came to this conclusion, we decided. I'm not interviewing your team, I'm interviewing you. So whenever you're thinking about these stories, think about what you specifically did. Pick out times where you made these decisions and you convinced the team to do whatever it was, or maybe you let out on something that your team decided to do. I want to hear about what you did. The R in PART stands for results, and this is something that a lot of people leave out for whatever reason, which I can always ask a follow-up question to ask what happened, but it's kind of nice for you to just put it in there naturally, because otherwise I'm sitting here captivated in a super amazing story, and I'm like, so what happened? Did she throw a smoothie in your face? Like, I don't know, I'm involved now, right? So it's really nice for you to kind of put that on the end and make sure that you mention that. The T in the PART method isn't always going to be relevant, but it can definitely add a lot of thought, intentionality, all these good things to your interview question. And by transfer, I really mean it could be a transfer of the knowledge that you learned from this situation, the skills that you gained, and how you're going to apply it to this role or how you've been applying it moving forward. So again, going back to what I said a second ago about it, it's not uncommon for them to ask in an interview about a time where the group dynamic wasn't amazing, a conflict within a group sort of situation, right? And maybe the result can be kind of negative. We let this guy just kind of drift off in the middle of nowhere, and then, we had to cover for him and it was a disaster. What did you learn from that? Did you learn that you should reach out as soon as someone is kind of slacking off to see if you can support them in any way? Did you learn that maybe 3 against 1 isn't the best way to confront somebody about this? What did you learn and how have you used that moving forward? That transfer is especially going to be helpful because employers also like to ask about a time where maybe you failed to meet expectations or you messed up in some way. Those are always really awkward questions to answer, but you should always be answering them truthfully because, again, they're not asking about a time that you messed up thinking that you're going to do it again. They want to see how you learned from that experience and what you've done differently moving forward, where, again, that transfer piece is really going to come in handy. So that's the PART method. So that's interview questions. We talked about the big 3. We talked about behavioral questions, which I think are really, really important. If you know those 4 types of questions, then you're definitely going to feel pretty confident going into your interview next time, or at least until you get to the interview site, which is where my nerves always tend to kick in, it seems like. So now I want to talk about after the interview, because I think this is an area that a lot of people overlook. They're so excited that they're done answering questions that they just kind of, and we're done. And there's actually some things that you should be considering / doing after the interview. The first thing is asking questions after they are done asking you questions. They always, or at least should, give you time to ask them questions. And if they say, do you have any questions for us? Your answer is always yes. And I have 3 types of questions for you to be thinking about preparing before you go into the interview, which you should be thinking about these questions before you go into the interview and write them down to make sure you ask them. The first type of question is an informational question. And what I mean by this is based on the job description, based on something that you've seen on the website, anything you need clarifying information on. And I have a couple bullet points here for example, questions that those could be. So, for example, if they just have great benefits on the job description, you can say, what does great benefits mean? If on the job description it says something about you working a swing shift, how often in advance would I know, right? Or if there's weekend work, how often and how far in advance would I know if I had to work a weekend? If the structure of the organization isn't super clear, you can definitely ask who you'll be reporting to. Anything that's concrete that you need clarifying information on goes under informational questions.
The second type of question, which I think is the most important, is a cultural question. And what I mean by that is, hopefully at this point, you all have some idea of things that you need in the workplace to not only survive, but to thrive. For me, that's open communication. That's feeling like I can give my supervisor honest feedback. That's some level of autonomy in my work. So based on these values that I have and things that I need environmentally to do well at my job, you can craft cultural questions around those. So for example, if you want that open communication with your supervisor, you can ask them what their supervisory style is like. If autonomy is important to you, how much autonomy can I expect to have in my work, right? Whatever your values are, you can definitely craft questions around those. And if you need help doing that, there's lots of questions on the internet that you can kind of fall back to as a resource if you're having trouble coming up with your own. Another question that I like a lot, if you're a very goal-oriented person, if you like to exceed expectations, you can ask what success in this position looks like so that you know what standards you have to meet before you even get there. So you can hit the ground running and blow everyone away. And then finally, if you don't ask a lot of informational cultural questions, you need to 100% ask a logistical question, which is, what are the next steps in this process? If they give kind of a vague answer, oh, we'll follow up with you in a couple weeks. What's a couple weeks? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 1 week? You need to know, because if they fail to meet their follow-up deadline, then that's a trigger for you to follow up with them. So always make sure you get a specific answer when you're asking these logistical questions. I also get a lot of questions in regards to thank you notes. Yes, you need to send a thank you note after an interview. Only about 10% of people follow up after an interview, so it's definitely going to help you stand out, and in a good way if you write a really good thank you note. Generally, you want to send them within 24 hours. It could be an email, it could be a physical thank you note, whatever your style is. I know when I was interviewing at the University of Utah, I did both. I sent an email thank you note like early on because I was living in Pennsylvania. I knew the letters were going to take a minute to get to Utah. So I sent a thank you email first to be like, I really appreciated interviewing with you. Know that physical thank you notes are on their way, just to give them that heads up so that they didn't think that I ghosted them. And then my second biggest thing when it comes to thank you notes is you need to personalize them. And this isn't as hard as everybody thinks it is. So during the interview, if you're interviewing with one person, a handful of people, whatever, you can be taking notes during your interview of what you're talking about with them. Try to, if you can, write down something specific each person said, so that when you're writing these thank you notes, you can say something to the effect of, I really appreciate the opportunity to interview. I especially appreciated us talking about specific thing that you wrote down, so that they know you were paying attention. Ideally, you'd send a thank you note to everybody, but if that's not possible, if you don't have everyone's contact information, then you can still send a personalized thank you note to the person that you've been in contact with and ask them to forward it to everybody else that was either on the panel or in the group interview, whatever the interview looked like. So thank you notes, very important. Do them well. It'll help you stand out in really amazing ways. Because I don't know if you all have heard, there's a global pandemic going on. I did want to talk briefly about video interviews because there are some nuances to video interviews that can help you stand out in really good ways. The video interviews were coming up in popularity before a global pandemic hit, but that's kind of what most people are referring to right now for interviews. So I wanted to touch base on a couple tips about this as well. So preparation for a video interview is going to look very similar to a normal in-person interview in a lot of different ways, but the space preparation is really what I mean here. So you want to make sure that your cables are all set up, you have Wi-Fi where you need it, or you can plug into the internet if that's what you need, your style, things like that. You want to make sure you have a charging cable with you. You want to make sure that you have everything available in your space to make sure that if something goes wrong, you can fix it quickly. Having your phone near you so that if the audio cuts out, you can call them really quick, right? You also want to prepare the background to make sure that it's a professional background, nothing too distracting going on in the back. I realize that most people are working from home and that might not always be possible, but when you can, preparing for that is also helpful. The next thing that I want to say about video tips is the angle of your camera. So right now, I'm going to be honest with you, my laptop is sitting on a book so that it's a little bit higher, so that I'm not looking down at the camera and you see this angle of my face as opposed to this angle of my face. You might have to get creative, but you know, if there's a webcam on your laptop, then you can open the camera app so that you can kind of test out the angles and see where you need to have it be, check your lighting, check all sorts of things before the interview. And then finally, eye contact. So when I'm giving these webinars and I'm talking to all of you, I'm actually looking directly at the camera on my laptop. When you're giving your interview responses, you want to look directly at the camera on your laptop, because otherwise, if you look at them, which I'm assuming the video of them would be on the main screen of my laptop, it looks like you're looking down and not really at them, where if I look here, it looks like I'm making eye contact with you. This can also really stand out and really make an impression. I know it's hard to stare at a little black dot when you're giving an interview in these very long responses, but I've heard of people putting pictures of their best friend behind their computer, putting arrows on their laptop, like pointing to the camera to be like, look here. You know, whatever you got to do, looking at that camera can really make a difference in a video interview. I also, as some of you know, am a big fan of memes, so I put a couple of my favorite memes here for interviews. Describe yourself in one word. Hired. Can he do that? Maybe. Please don't do that. And then how would you describe yourself? Verbally, but I've also prepared to dance. Just to lighten the interview mood up a little bit. So now that we've talked through a lot of strategies when it's come to interview, we've talked through questions, preparation, things you should do afterwards, video interviewing. How are you all feeling now in a single word to drop in the chat about interviewing? Y'all are so stunned that you have no words to share. Confident, we're feeling better about the webcam part specifically. Anything else we're feeling? Love that we're feeling just straight up confident. That makes me feel better about my presentation. Cool. So one more thing I want to say before we move on to questions that I realize now that I forgot to say. I mentioned a lot during my webinar that you're never going to know exactly what they're going to ask. You can do a bunch of preparation, a whole bunch of note taking, all the things, but you're never going to know exactly what they're going to ask you. So during the interview, when they ask you a question that you weren't necessarily expecting, it's 100% okay to say, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. And then take some time to reflect and craft your answer. Like I said, I've done a lot of mock interviews at this point, and I'm always really impressed when someone asks for that extra time because it shows me that they know themselves. And usually when they do ask for that extra time and really think about their answer, it's way better than if they would have just like charged forth and kind of hoped for the best. Don't be like Michael Scott in The Office where he's like, sometimes I start sentences and even I don't know where they're going. This is literally the opposite time of when you want to do that. So don't be afraid to ask for a little bit of extra time to think. And on that note, do you all have any questions when it comes to interviewing? Trying to see. Y'all can just, because there's so few of us, drop it in the chat instead of using the Q&A function. Thank you for saying this was helpful. Any questions, concerns?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for giving us great tactics to conquer the anxiety of interviewing. If you guys need to get in contact with Crystal, as always, her LinkedIn and email are on the screen right now, so feel free to reach out. Part 4 of this job search series and our final part is next Thursday, and it will be covering and networking, which I should know as Tippy Connect is a networking organization. So fantastic. I'm super excited to learn more about the intricacies of networking and how getting your foot in the door can help land you a job. Last reminder, Tippy Connect is top 10 under 40 nominations and application forms are open. So those will be sent with the follow-up emails as well as the registration to our next and final part 4 of the job search series and your follow-up emails. If you'd like to rewatch this webinar, you can visit us at tippyconnect.com/events. I'm going to launch a poll right now if everyone could quickly take that. Thank you for sharing your lunch with us. Thank you, Crystal, for all the amazing information, and we'll see everyone next Thursday.
Thanks again, everybody, and I hope to see you next week for networking.